welcome back. Well, I'm absolutely delighted to be welcoming Shashi Tharoor back. We didn't have enough fun yesterday, so we brought you back for more. And the session is titled A Disruptor. How do you feel being called a disruptor?
I don't feel that good about it because I sort of always had this reputation for being the conciliator, the peacemaker, the diplomatic guy in politics. Somebody who tries to reconcile everyone, tries to get things going, sees merit in not seeing everything in black and white. So clearly Manoj doesn't think that's good enough. He's decided I'm a disruptor, so I'll accept it.
Member of Parliament for Thiruvufam. Oh my!
You did it well yesterday.
I did it so well. Let me just slow down, and I'm going to crack it. Thiruvananthapuram. Okay, I did pretty well. Third term in the Lok Sabha. Also former Undersecretary General at the United Nations and author of countless number of books, including one we might touch on. We spoke about it yesterday, Inglorious Empire, What the British Did to India, which I'm in the process of reading right now. So this is all about being a disruptor. Let's start with one area where I know that you were quite disruptive at the time. You were an early adopter of Twitter.
I was.
And you quickly, while in government, built an audience of millions. Am I right?
It was, when I came into government, I just published my previous book before entering government was a book called The Elephant, the Tiger, and the Cell Phone, which talked about how technology was the big disruptor in India's development progress. And in fact, I'd even said that I wanted to have on the cover a photograph that had been going around the internet from the previous Kumbh Mela, this big Hindu religious festival. And it was a classic looking photograph of a Hindu holy man, a sadhu, right out of Hollywood Central casting. Sort of naked torso, Rudraksha mala around his neck, ash-smeared forehead, warts on his face, gazing away seemingly into the timeless distance. Your absolute cliched picture. Except that in this photograph, this sadhu, gazing away into the distance, was actually chatting on a mobile phone. And I said, this is what India is all about. Now, you really have to reconcile, get your mind around both these images. So when I came into government, let's use Twitter. Let's try and get the message across. We don't have to depend on what the media considers newsworthy. We can make news this way. But in fact, the hurdles were placed by my own side to begin with. Government computers could not be used for social media.
Right.
So I had to wait to sort of be out of the building and do it on my mobile phone. Second, or my personal computer at home. Second, in fact, there was overt disapproval of what I was doing.
Were you told
and in those very early days, I have to admit, there was also a fair amount of resistance from the mainstream media. It didn't take a heck of a long time for them to finally come over, but I was the victim because literally anything I said on Twitter was deliberately made into a controversy by the media, because they said, why should this fellow bypass us? And so it was
But did that just not drive more audience to you?
It did.
Yeah.
So the audience, I was actually India's leading Twitter user for quite a while.
Until overtaken by?
No. First overtaken by the Bollywood stars.
Okay.
Actually, no, first overtaken by Sachin Tendulkar, just short of the 1 million mark, and the cricketer. And then overtaken by some Bollywood stars. But I remained India's leading politician all the way till July 2013, when I was overtaken by a certain Narendra Modi, who is now about 10 times the followers I have. So. But what was interesting actually in that whole Modi business was that whereas the government was sniffy and disapproving and nobody else in my party was on social media, and I suppose I could understand it because government historically had a certain reserve, a certain reticence, Modi and the opposition realized how useful social media could be for them, to use the word again, to disrupt the prevailing mainstream narrative. Because suddenly they had a channel that was not subject to the gatekeepers of the establishment and the media, and was a forum where they could get their point of view across. And they became far better at it than most of us for a very long time. In fact, it was striking when Mr. Modi became Prime Minister in 2014, he issued an instruction that every member of his cabinet had to open a Twitter account. And the sudden proliferation of BJP ministers on Twitter. The Congress finally realized the error of their ways and they began catching up. 2014, they were still very, very behind. But by 2019 elections, I think they were giving as good as they got. But of course, the head start the BJP and Mr. Modi has is not going to be easy to catch up with.
So I'm a citizen of this country in the United Kingdom, but also the United States. And there was a time when the president of my other country, President Trump, was a huge disruptor on Twitter. That going direct to people is something that those voters really appreciated. But it is also scary, right? It's scary.
There's no filter.
If there's no filter, and if false news is being spread, right? And from a US perspective, that was worrying. And it was very interesting to me how Twitter dealt with that in terms of eventually kicking him off the platform. Do you think that's the right thing to do?
That actually is an issue that came up in the committee I chair in Parliament, the IT committee, where, interestingly enough, a lot of our ruling party members were appalled by what had happened. And they were saying that, if you did this to an Indian minister or prime minister, we would not permit it, because what gives you the right to deny a public platform to an Indian official? Unless that official has done something which is criminal under Indian law, where does Twitter derive its authority from? And it's a complicated debate. Freedom of speech versus hate speech. On the one hand, we like to hold platforms like Twitter and Facebook responsible if they actually broadcast irresponsible things, hate speech, live footage of people being killed and so on. All of these things we object to rightly. So we are essentially making them responsible to some degree for content. So if they have the right to be responsible, do they not have the right to decide if somebody is too irresponsible for their taste? And this is not resolved yet. It's a lively debate, and people are...
What do you think the answer is? What do you think the answer should be?
I'm still working on it, but as the chairman of the committee, I'm going to have to hold my judgment until the committee has endorsed it. I will say that we are troubled by some of these things. In some ways, the easiest standard is the national one, because when companies like Twitter and Facebook say, we follow our community standards, well, your community isn't the community in which you're operating in our country. So how about our community standards, and what should those be? Now, in some respects, saying something against a particular religion may be perfectly acceptable free speech in America, but might incite a riot in India. Equally, taking action for certain kinds of extreme tweeting might trouble people in India, because what they've done is within the letter of what the law is in India.
I mean, there's an interesting moment. If we take a look at something that came up yesterday with this idea of your original Oxford Union debate around what the British did to India, which resulted in the end in the book that I'm currently reading. But you went and did this debate in Oxford around reparations, around what should be done post-empire. You thought it was fine. It went up on the internet. You tweeted about it, and suddenly it went bananas viral, right?
3 million downloads in 24 hours, and it kept going,
Right place, right time? What was that about?
That was the Prime Minister's phrase. He very generously actually said that this speech was an example of somebody saying the right thing in the right place at the right time, which of course was all very well, but he was 2 months away from his first visit to the UK. And there was consternation in diplomatic circles, both in India and the UK. I knew the British High Commissioner, who was terrified at that point that this was going to cast a blight on the Prime Minister's visit. And I can be a little indiscreet now that it's so many years after the event. And the Prime Minister's speechwriter for that trip was a Foreign Service officer whom I knew well. And he called me and said, what do I do? Because this can't be ignored. It's become too big an issue. So I said, my suggestion would be, you say that others have addressed the question of historical wrongs. I want to focus on the future. And then the Prime Minister can stay clear of this and continue talking about the future Indo-British relationship. And I'm pleased to say that's exactly what he did in September 2015.
So a conciliator.
And as you know, he's had many successful visits since.
Absolutely. A conciliator once more, not a disruptor.
There you are. That's the point I've been trying to make. Thank you.
So let's just pause on that, though, because we're talking about the future, reimagining the relationship between the UK and India. But do you not think we need to always keep in mind history in order that we not repeat the mistakes of the past?
Yeah, I mean, I have, that's one reason, but not the only reason. I think it's also important, just as any child should know a little bit about their own ancestry, their parents, their grandparents, and so on. Every society has to be aware of how it came to where it is today. And a sense of history is, I believe, important for every society. But to use history to continue to affect the present and the future is unwise. And so my message when I published Inglorious Empire was, we must forgive, but we must not forget.
Yeah.
And as I said, particularly to young people, if you don't know where you're coming from, how will you appreciate where you're going? So remember where you've come from, remember all that happened, but don't let that guide how you behave today. Because today is today, and you're working for tomorrow.
Yeah.
But you just be aware of what's happened in the past. Don't forget, but do move on past it.
Speaking of being aware of what happened in the past, not forgetting in order for the future, let's talk a little about Ukraine. I know that you're one of the very few politicians who've argued against the current stance in Ukraine. But I wonder if you could just talk us through a little bit about your worries there. And we've got some young people. We may be off message at the moment. We'll take that into account. But
that's the disruption.
There you go. Welcome disruption. We're a broad church here. But talk me through that.
No, I mean, I did take a heretical view because I do understand the Indian position, and quite possibly had my party been in power, they might have taken the same approach, which is partially based on gratitude to the Soviet Union for decades of support for India in the Security Council, elsewhere on Kashmir, other issues, and therefore by extension support for Russia today. Secondly, there was also undoubtedly a dependence on Russia for armaments, which Russia sold to us at a time that the West was not prepared to sell us armaments. And so we did have an enormous, at one point 85% of our defense supplies came from Russia alone. And naturally, no one wanted to jeopardize that relationship, not to mention spare parts and so on had to keep coming. Even though now the dependence has gone down, and 85% is now more like 45%, that's still a fairly hefty proportion. My argument was, number one, that we can't afford to be on the wrong side of history. This was an unprovoked, unjustified war, and we should not be condoning it. I was critical of India's first couple of statements at the UN, which I felt were unnecessarily mealy-mouthed. They've corrected it immediately after that, and at least started reiterating principles we've always stood for, the integrity and sovereignty of states, the inviolability of borders, the inadmissibility of changing or settling foreign disputes through the use of force. These are all things India has consistently reiterated over 75 years, and I thought we should have done that from our very first intervention, but I'd say from about our third speech onwards we have been doing that. We've also given humanitarian aid to Ukraine, 90 tons in the first week of the war, or first 10 days anyway. It was a very good gesture. And when I spoke in Parliament, I acknowledged those, but I also said that Russia today is not only wrong, but it's also going to emerge, whatever happens in this war and however long it takes, it's going to emerge weakened. And a weakened Russia is going to be more dependent on China, which is our real adversary and our principal adversary. So a Russia that is dependent on China is not going to be a terribly useful ally in geopolitical terms, or a partner we can rely upon. Secondly, I argued that if you look at the spare parts and so on that you want and new orders that you want them to fulfill, their industry, including their military industry, is at the moment devastated by sanctions. You can't import semiconductor chips into Russia, for example.
We had Tata earlier today offering to make military supplies from within India. They're very much hoping that they'll be able to do that.
The British will.
No, Tata.
Oh, yeah. No, so we want to have much more manufacturing in India and involve the private sector. We have a public sector manufacturing, which the military doesn't think very highly of. But if we can get the private sector and with international collaboration improve the quality, that's certainly one of the important things we can and should be doing. But on the question of dependence on Russia, I was just saying that they can't fulfill their contracts with you anyway now. So we need to look beyond the old paradigms and find ways of positioning ourselves that would be attractive to other countries who perhaps may need more. That was essentially my argument. Ultimately, of course, the government always knows more than the opposition because they have access to what goes on behind closed doors and classified conversations they don't have.
So unfair.
No, I know, but that's even in democracies we can't always be on an equal footing.
Final comment. We've run out of time. I'll sneak one more question out of you, one more answer. We're reimagining the UK-India relationship. What's the one thing we absolutely must do?
I think get it on a footing of equality, because I think there are still sort of lingering attitudes among some sectors, and certainly the older generation in the UK, that need to go. And there's got to be much more awareness of the kinds of things we are seeing showcased in this forum. That is, tech companies, the young entrepreneurs, the unicorns, the possibility for cooperation that's focused on tomorrow rather than hung up on yesterday. And I think if we can do that, I hope this FTA that everybody seems so optimistic about will actually happen. And then I also hope that we will get to see some real sort of a relationship between equals when it comes to other aspects of it. Of course, that doesn't mean I want to draw in the test match starting tomorrow. I still want to beat the English, but that we'll see that happening.
Round of applause. Yep, there we go. Well, thank you very much for your time. Honorable Dr. Shashi Tharoor, thank you very much. We appreciate it. And I'm very pleased to finally see you in person. Our interactions have previously been all virtual.
That's right. The last two India Global Forums, we were virtual.
Exactly, exactly. Wonderful. Well, thank you very much. Stay with us, because in just a moment, we'll be back with Beyond the Boom with my colleague Mark Barton. He's waiting in the wings. Until then, we'll see you in a moment.